The Verify team is here to answer your questions about possible misinformation spreading online. And with coronavirus dominating the headlines, it might be easy to forget that the big election is just 3 months away. A viewer sent us this email, wondering what happens if there's a disputed election. She asked us to verify if the election is close in 2020, will the final decision be made by the Supreme Court? Here are our sources. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, the 12th Amendment, Bush v. Gore, the landmark Supreme Court ruling from 2000, and a pair of experts in politics and law. First off, let's all remember that the presidency is decided by the Electoral College, not the popular vote. Here's how it works. 538 electors are distributed across the country. And to win the presidency, a candidate needs a majority, meaning at least 270 of these electoral votes. So what happens if nobody reaches 270? Well, in that very uncommon situation, which hasn't happened since 1824, the winner would be decided by the House of Representatives. That is the process. So how could the Supreme Court get involved? Well, to answer that, you need to look no further than the 2000 election. That's when the votes in Florida were too close to call. And that one state would tip the balance and give somebody 270 electoral votes. Democrat Al Gore wanted to continue a recount, while Republican George W. Bush did not. And the process was pushing up against a federal deadline. The Supreme Court decided to rule on the case, announcing that the recount was over, essentially giving Bush the victory.
That was very unusual.
Georgetown law professor Susan Block said that before 2000, most thought the Supreme Court stepping in was incredibly unlikely. Now she says the door is open.
That could happen here. If there's a dispute on the counting of the ballots in any state or many states, the nice tradition of conceding might be in some jeopardy.
So we can verify that yes, the Supreme Court can get involved to resolve a dispute. And there's a precedent for this, as of 20 years ago. With your Verify, this is Evan Kozloff.